Most of the changes we've been talking about in this class so far have taken place very slowly, and though we've come back to this slide a little bit, we haven't really spent time talking about most of the ideas on this course concept map. We've talked a little bit about the very slow rise of symbolic thought, the evolution of the brain, that's the connection with human biology and the environment that we were evolving in. We talked a little bit about the planning involved in early tools, early technology, though those changes took place really quite slowly. You know, the million years that the Acheulean tradition lasted, 1.8 million to about 600,000 years, and of course the half of a million years or so or more that the Oldowan tradition lasted before the Acheulean tradition developed. We talked a little bit about concepts like family, although that doesn't necessarily mean family in the sense that some folks want to interpret it today, or group identity or ideology, perhaps something like religion arising as early as the Neanderthal sites at Shenandoah. But most of the changes we've talked about have been very slow ones based in the biological changes of skull shape and body features. And we haven't actually touched on the majority of the things on this screen. From this point forward in the course, we're going to start picking up the pace, and we're going to start touching on more and more of these different ideas. We left off the last lecture with the development of a species a whole lot like us, in fact, effectively like us. We call them anatomically modern humans. They're so much like us. They developed about 200,000 years ago or so in Africa. And we talked about how that species left Africa somewhere between 40 and 100,000 years ago, depending on which bits of evidence you focus on, probably somewhere around 70,000 years ago, and reviewed the evidence that suggested that those folks more or less replaced the other archaic populations, archaic Homo sapien populations that were living in the rest of the world. The world that these people, these critters, were living in was very, very different from the one that we are looking at today. Remember, this is the period called the Pleistocene, meaning the period more commonly called the Ice Age, or a series of ice ages followed by warming periods. And for large parts of the Pleistocene, much of the world looked like the map that you're looking at on the screen right now. The white areas are ice sheets, and the brown areas where we don't normally see land are actually parts of the what is now the seabed that would have been exposed as dry land during the maximum glaciation, the period where the glaciers were at their largest, and the glaciers covered very large chunks of the earth, and that of course trapped very large amounts of water, very large amounts of moisture, and so sea levels as a result were substantially lower. So at this maximum glaciation, you see that here in North America, pretty much all of what's today Canada and Alaska and a very large chunk of the northern part of the lower 48 states are all covered in a vast ice sheet that goes all the way to the North Pole. It goes down below Michigan here. Other glaciers stand alone on the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains, in the Andean Mountains in South America, and in Europe, the northern part of Europe, all of Scandinavia, northern Germany, all of Denmark, the Low Countries, most of the British Isles. All of these areas covered by very large glaciers. The land forms some things that are pretty unfamiliar too. Florida would have looked an awful lot bigger and fatter, and so would have South America, which we're used to seeing as rather pointy. Britain would have been connected to the rest of Europe across the English Channel, which doesn't exist in this map. But probably the biggest area of change is over here in Southeast Asia and Australia, where we see that the island that's now got the island of New Guinea, that's got Papua New Guinea, and half of the island is part of Indonesia, is connected to Australia in one large landmass, and all of the little islands that make up Indonesia and Malaysia here and Southeast Asia are connected to the mainland, and they form a very large sort of another continent almost. But one thing to take note of here is that the whole continent of Australia and the large area that it's connected to is actually never connected to the mainland. There's actually a very large, there's islands in the middle here, but there's also very large stretches of water in between those. It's during this time, however, that we actually start to see the first Australians, the first people spreading across from Asia to Australia. Remember, we had Australopithecines in Africa, and the first of our ancestors to move out of Africa was Homo erectus about 1.8 million years ago, which spread into Asia and southern Europe. It's only now that we get the radiation of anatomically modern humans out of Africa and spreading into Asia and Europe that we actually see any of our ancestors going beyond those two. And the first to arrive in Africa, the first to arrive in Australia probably did so in the neighborhood of 50,000 or more years ago, 50 to 60,000 years ago, during the late Pleistocene. This phenomenon was actually noticed by Alfred Russel Wallace as far back as the 1850s. He's a naturalist who traveled to this area, this part of the world, and he didn't recognize it in quite the same geologic sense that we recognize it now. What he did was he noticed that the animal species were the same, or very similar to each other, on many of the different islands that he was looking at in the area. But all of a sudden, there was a point where they started to be a very different set of animals. All the animals that he encountered on Sumatra and Borneo and Java were pretty similar to each other, and they had cousins on each of these different islands. But if you go out to Australia, we all know that there are a lot of animals that are unique to Australia. Kangaroos and all sorts of other interesting creatures. This is because the animals on the Australian side were separated evolutionarily from all of the animals in the rest of the world for a very, very long period of time. Now, if you know the name Alfred Russel Wallace, or if it sounds rather familiar, you may remember that he is credited as being the co-discoverer of the idea of natural selection, along with the guy who ended up getting all the press, Charles Darwin. What does this have to do with anatomically modern humans and their spread around the world? The thing is that Wallace noticed that this division between these two no longer existing land masses, which, as you see on the map here, are named Sunda and Sahul. Geologists like to name land masses and islands even if they don't exist anymore. So they've named this sort of super continent or new subcontinent that once existed, tying together the mainland and the islands of Borneo and Sumatra as an area called Sunda, and the sort of supercontinent of New Guinea and all the small islands around Australia and Tasmania itself. All of these were once joined together into a landmass named Sahul. Wallace's note that the animals differed between Sunda and Sahul had one exception, and that, of course, is anatomically modern humans. Somehow, people managed to bridge this gap. Looking at this map here with all these little islands in between, it doesn't actually strike us as particularly shocking that people could get across this line. But you have to remember that the scale we're looking at here, in the geologists who sort of study the different levels of the sea and naturalists who look at the distribution of different kinds of animals, they argue about which islands were joined at what time and for how long. But everyone agrees that there was no direct connection between Sunda and Sahul any time in the last several million years. And in fact, the consensus is pretty clear that there was actually no point in which you could see from from some island on the one side to some island on the other. That there was always a stretch where you had to sail outside the sight of land to get between Sunda and Sahul. That there would have been a gap of at least 100 kilometers, or 60-odd miles, 65 miles, of open ocean that you would have had to make across. And this was enough of a barrier to stop any kangaroo from ever getting to Sunda, or any orangutan from ever getting from Sunda to Sahul and populating the other side. But it didn't stop the ancestors of modern Australian Aborigines from making this journey in some sort of seagoing vessel. How intentional this was, how much navigation they would have had, is a question of debate. But it's clear that the ancestors of modern Aboriginal people, by 50 or 60,000 years ago, so an extraordinarily long time ago, had some sort of ability to navigate the ocean, at least coastally, and probably getting out of sight of land rather comfortably, using the sun or the stars to navigate back to their homes. And it was in one of these journeys that someone found islands farther out that you couldn't actually see from islands connected to or visible from Sunda, and eventually made the journey across to settle Australia. If there was ever any doubt that we're dealing with us 50 or 60,000 years ago, that we're dealing with a creature that has the mental capacity to be as inventive and as creative as you and I are today, I think this should the evidence from Australia really should put an end to that. So if the people arrived in Australia first by sea, if they were seagoing people, we should find our first evidence for them on the coastline, and we don't. Now, of course, the problem with that idea is that what is the coastline has changed. If you look back at this map, you'll notice that the coastline of present-day Australia here, on the northwest coast of Australia, the closest to Sunda, where the ancestors of modern Aboriginal people would have had to come, is actually several hundred miles from the coastline at the time. So it is almost certain that the first people who settled this area were coastal people who would have lived on the coasts of this Sunda continent and in on these islands that were in the near shore, and that came across to the Sunda continent, and to the Sahul continent, and settled on the coast here, practicing the same food gathering and hunting and fishing techniques that they would have had access to on the other sides of the channel. But we don't have any evidence of that, because all of those sites are now under hundreds of feet of water, hundreds of miles out into the ocean. The earliest sites that we have confirmed and sort of clear evidence from are in the interior. And so that means there's probably a bit of a lag, hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years between these earliest clearly dated sites and the actual first settlement, pushing that technological development of seafaring even farther back. Willandra Lakes, shown on the map and the slide here, is probably the earliest famous large-scale site that is recognized for Aboriginal occupation here. The site is actually a little bit of a misnomer, as you can see in the image on the screen's lower left. The lakes in question actually dried up about 14,000 years ago. These are fossil lakes. You can see a little map here. Areas that quite clearly were shaped by water, but the changing environment at the end of the Pleistocene actually dried them up and left them relatively frozen, metaphorically, of course. The temperatures are rather high for actual ice. One of the things that's really useful about this for us, though, is that so many of the areas that were occupied, and this is true anywhere in the world, that were occupied 10 or 15,000 years ago by our ancestors, have been occupied since, and much later settlement would have, of course, obscured the earlier traces, which are left relatively intact here in Australia. People live in this area now and have for the last 14,000 years, but there certainly have not been the number of people making the kinds of sites that that they lived here and made when the site was first occupied, when there were actual lakes here. The sites at Willandra Lakes, there's a whole series of them. The earliest dating for these sites after they were discovered in the 1960s put the sites at about 32,000 years in the past. And this is a time period where white Australians at the time made up probably all of the archaeologists, and certainly almost all, if not all, of the academics in Australia due to various government and educational policies. Those Australians and those white Australians really didn't expect that Australia had been occupied for more than about the last 20,000 years or so. And the reason is sort of the opposite of what we were just discussing. They were quite sure that that Australian ancestors Aboriginal ancestors didn't have the ability to make boats to get across the Wallace Line that was observed back in the 19th century. So the discovery of Willandra Lakes and the first dating that we got from this, the radiocarbon dates that gave us absolute chronology for this area, pushed that back quite substantially. Actually, now we're really quite sure that Willandra Lakes has been occupied was occupied at least 45 to 60,000 years ago, really not long after anatomically modern humans left Africa to begin with. Remember, if we've got that common great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother in the eastern side of Africa about 40 to 70,000 years ago, the evidence here would suggest pretty strongly that if we've got somebody leaving Africa 70,000 years ago and spreading to Asia and Europe, that was a very successful and a very fast spread, only 10,000 years maybe, to go all the way to Southeast Asia and then make their way across the Wallace Line to Australia and then move into the interior to settle Willandra Lakes. So, it took a very long time for us to develop in Africa, a very long time for us to spread out of Africa, and now with anatomically modern humans, the pace is really picking up, as I said at the beginning of this lecture. What are we finding in this site? We're finding sites that will actually, that are in a lot of ways pretty similar to the kinds of things we'll find all around the rest of the world. We've got hearths where people are lighting fires and cooking their food. We've got tools, much like the tools that are being used technologically around the rest of the world. Very impressive Paleolithic technologies. We've got shell middens. Large numbers of shellfish were harvested at these lakes back when there was water there. We have human burials, of course, including probably the oldest cremation found anywhere in the world, dating to about 40,000 years ago. By 18,000 years ago, towards the later end of the occupation at Willandra Lakes, we actually have groundstone technology. This is something that we see as generally developing, and we sort of connected it with the next period we'll talk about, Neolithic technology, the Neolithic period that we'll get to in the next lecture. Groundstone technology, stone that is created by grinding two stones together instead of banging two stones together, which is called knapping. Again, we'll get to in the next lecture. This probably means they were processing wild grasses in this area, so they were not farming, but they were doing pretty much everything else that you would recognize with farming in terms of the harvesting and processing of grains. They just simply didn't need to bother planting it. A lot of the burials contain this material on the sort of top left of the screen. It's not a heart art piece. It does sort of in this particular image look like sort of a traditional heart image. It's actually a piece of what's called red ochre. And red ochre, here's a burial that is got a large amount of red ochre powder spread across through it. This particular image is actually not from Willandra Lakes. It's just I found a better picture of a burial with red ochre at a site in Austria, not Australia, just coincidental that the names are so similar. So in Central Europe, that dates to about the same time that we're talking about at Willandra Lakes, so it's about 27 to 40,000 years ago for this burial in Central Europe. But the same kind of thing was found at Willandra Lakes. Red ochre is a naturally occurring mineral. It's a mineral with a very high iron content, which is why it's got this red color. Of course, iron is a big part of the red blood cells and gives blood its red color, and that's why this stone has the same color as blood. The connection of red and blood and the sort of basic symbolic leaf between blood and life and death. Blood, of course, is involved in death, in diseases, but in violent killings. But it's also, of course, involved in birth in many contexts. We're clearly looking at something which is recognizable as ideology, broadly speaking. It's ceremonial. It might be called religious. And the finds of red ochre burials at Willandra Lakes, again, it's another indication that we're seeing something that is a creature that is us, right? We're looking at us.
Australia's indigenous sanctuary, Willandra Lakes region. Willandra Lakes region is in New South Wales in Australia. Many thousands of years ago, there were many lakes in this inland area. However, they all dried up about 20,000 years ago. It's believed that indigenous hunter-gatherers lived here for 50 to 60,000 years. However, after the arrival of European settlers in the late 18th century, they were persecuted and their numbers declined dramatically. Today, plants and trees grow out of what used to be the lake bed. Eroded by the rain and the wind, sand pinnacles have formed, and ants and termites make their home here. Previously, the indigenous people used to dig up the ants' nests and either ate them in small pieces or used the nest to make fires.
This fireplace has been made by termite nests.
One area is particularly sacred for descendants of the ancients. It's covered for preservation. Footprints belonging to their ancestors were discovered here. Human bones from 40,000 years ago have also been discovered here. Researchers have also uncovered signs suggesting ritual ceremonies were held when the bones were buried. For the indigenous descendants, it's a highly spiritual place where they can reconnect with their ancestors.